He was very hungry when he woke the next morning. He was in need of water too, for he had only a few drops left. He'd left the village in the evening before some way behind him, but he could see another bigger one down in the valley. He might be able to earn some money there, but he was by no means certain of it. The evening was the best time to earn money, and the best time to be in town too, because then he could escape quickly into the shelter of the darkness. But this time he would have to go into town in daylight. He couldn't wait until evening to get more water. He opened his bundle to drink what was left. At the bottom of his bundle he found a strange box, the sort used for cigarettes, and in the box there was money, more money than David had ever seen, 2,000 lira. 1 lira was not very much. You could get practically nothing for 1 lira, but 2,000? Apart from the money, there was something written on the slip of paper, a letter. David had never had a letter, and he almost wished that he'd got one now, for he found it very difficult to read handwriting, and he'd never tried reading English. But he wouldn't give up, and after an hour he was fairly sure he knew what was in the letter. It was the American who'd written it, and he'd said he was quite sure that David would not accept the money and that he'd hidden it in the bundle. He also said that they were sorry that they had thought that he might steal. Not all strange boys are honest. We suspected an honest boy. We didn't mean you to understand what we said. We would be glad if you would make use of this money to show you we have no hard feelings towards us. And then came a name that David could not read. David's first thought was that he would now be able to buy a new cake of soap. He had money for bread and many days, and there would be still enough for soap and perhaps a comb too. He told himself he mustn't be greedy. Johannes had not liked people to be greedy, and it would be sensible to keep some of the money by him for more bread later on. He would buy soap and perhaps 1 or 2 other things, but no more. And he would not be in a hurry. He would first consider carefully what he most needed. The result was that he bought a loaf of bread, a cake of soap and a comb. Combing his hair was painful, for no one in the camp had a comb for a very long time, and David's hair had not been combed since. He looked into his mirror to see what he looked like. His hair looked as if it were growing lighter in colour, and it was very long. David reflected seriously, and he bought himself a pair of scissors and a pencil and a small pad of notepaper as well. The scissors to cut his hair with so that he would not look conspicuous. That means, conspicuous means stand out. And the pencil and paper because for many days now he'd wished he could write. Johannes had begun to teach him once. Perhaps if he could practice, he could learn to do it properly. It might stand him in good stead to be able to write. One never knew when it might prove useful. He was not used to having more money than the price of a loaf of bread, and he found this unexpected wealth a problem. He had now spent almost half of it. The scissors had been expensive. Still, he would have enough to buy bread for many days to come, and he had a great desire to try some cheese. If he could just get a bit for 50 lira. It tasted good, even better than he'd remembered it. He'd had it once in the camp and again in the van on the road to Salonika. When he had satisfied his hunger, he began cutting his hair. He was sitting under an olive tree, and he placed the mirror on the low branch so that it leaned up against the trunk. Cutting the tufts at the back of his neck, where he could not see what he was doing, provided a tricky business, but at length he was satisfied with the result. He wondered if he dared try out his plan of getting a lift. If he chose one of those lorries that transported foodstuffs, they never drove them. But every time a lorry approached, he lacked the courage to try, although he had made up his mind to do it. He was so frightened he could feel his heart beat faster and his throat grow tight, and then he thought of God. God of the green pastures and the still waters, he said softly, I'm David, and I'm frightened. Not just an ordinary fear that you always have, worse than that. I want to beg a lift so that I can get quickly to another country, but I daren't. If you're strong enough to do something about what people think and feel right inside themselves, then you will please take this fear away, just long enough for me to wave at a lorry. And if it isn't greedy to ask for 2 things at once, will you let it be a good man that comes out in the next? I haven't yet found anything I can do for you. I am David. Amen. It seemed that God was strong enough, for when the next lorry came along, David was no longer too frightened to get up and step into the roadway. The lorry driver looked exactly like the sailor who had shielded him aboard the ship. David waved, the man pulled up and asked where he was going, and David answered, to Perugia. as he had decided he would when he formed his plan. Perugia was a long way. It would take him 3 days to walk there. And so there he was, sitting in the lorry with the side of the stranger, who was so like the sailor. And when he told his tale about the circus, the man asked him no questions at all, obviously preferring to do the talking himself. He was called Angelo, and he gave David a mass of detailed information about his home and family. He had both father and mother and many brothers and sisters, and then there was a woman called Rita who he wanted to marry when he'd saved enough money to buy a lorry of his own. But his father wanted to marry someone called Chlorina, and her father had a vineyard. Do you know what a vineyard is? It's a place where they grow grapes to make wine. He talked about it at great length as if it were not sure that he should marry, and he asked David what he thought. David considered the matter. "Are they both good people?" he asked finally. "For if there's any difference, you'll see, I think you'd better marry the one that's good and kind. You could buy a vineyard yourself perhaps when you've earned enough money. But I think you've got to decide for yourself. Besides, your father hasn't thought whether they're kind. Perhaps you must make quite sure about it before you choose." Angelo frowned. Then he smiled and nodded. "I think you're a very clever boy," he said, "and I'll do what you say." Then he chatted on about his plans for the future, and David listened, but not with the same attention as before. Angelo was stupid. He was a good man, but he was stupid. David was puzzled because he always thought that good people must be clever. He thought about it for a long time. Could he have been mistaken? He knew so little about anything. But no, Angelo was a grown man, and here was one thing he was quite free to decide for himself, and yet he was ready to let others make up his mind for him. That could only be stupidity. When they'd been driving for several hours, Angelo pulled up and shared his food with David. He gave him a little drink from his bottle of wine as well, and a little later on they came into Perugia. It was a large town situated on top of a hill, but David asked to be put down on the way up of the hill, and when Angelo had driven on, he walked to the point where the main road continued into the countryside. He had no need for either bread or water, and he preferred to remain in the open. His plan to stop a lorry and ask for a lift had gone off very well. Perhaps he would stop another the next day, provided that he weren't too frightened. But he would have had to do it on his own, whilst he had not found anything he could do in return. He could not go on asking God for things. It would be greedy, and God might very soon grow tired of a boy who was always frightened and could never do anything for himself. And suppose he grew tired of him the very day something happened that David could not possibly deal with by himself. David did not know that the very next day something would happen that he could not tackle alone, and he still would not ask for help. Chapter 4. David had never seen a forest before. He had had a lift that morning and had come a long way by car, and although he wanted to waste no time, he thought he might spend an hour or two finding out what a forest looked like. He liked it at first, but after a while he began to feel uneasy. You could hide behind tree trunks, but so could they. He felt more at ease when he was out in the open again. He could not make up his mind whether they were really after him or not. If they were, it was not because he knew anything. Johannes had always said, every time a new prisoner entered the camp, don't tell the boy anything, they might try to worm it out of you afterwards. Later on, when Johannes was dead, others had said the same thing, and the man had known that there was always the possibility that he was a useful hostage. Suppose, for example, he had had a father, and the father had been their enemy, then they might have threatened him with the fact that they had David in their power. Not that David really believed it could be so. He couldn't imagine ever having had a father, but he had to reckon with the possibility that there was some reason that made it necessary for him to find him, and that was as near as he could get. He was suddenly aware of a strange sound. He looked quickly around and threw himself down behind a clump of bushes. There he was again, walking along and thinking without even looking where he was going. There was a house close by, and he could see it amongst the trees, a large house, and beautiful to look at, almost like a church. What was that sound? It was strange, yes, and wonderful too. When he was in Naples, he had seen a balloon. If you could turn into a balloon, that sound was what you might feel like, as if you had a great space inside you, and it was all filled with air, a heavenly air full of sweet voices that made you fly up and that your heart beat faster and faster, not because you were afraid, because you were happy. Was that what happiness felt like? And David knew he was listening to music. There had once been a musician in the camp, and before he had been there long enough to lapse into silence, he'd talked about music and tried to explain what it sounded like. But David had not understood. He understood now, though, however. That sound seemed to flood right into your very being and draw you upwards and upwards. That was all the instruments playing together, and that thin, delicate sound that made your heart beat so fast? That must be the violin. What the heck? You young thief forcing your way into people's grounds in broad daylight? I'll show you. Come here and I'll give you a damn good hiding. The voice felt like an explosion on David's ears. The wonderful sound of the music lay murdered, crushed and kicked to death by an evil voice. He'd just managed to catch sight of a boy, a black-haired boy with spiteful eyes, and before he was fully occupied in trying to ward off the blows, it was impossible to get away, for the boy was as big as himself, and to escape would mean hitting back. David shielded his head against the boy's blows and clenched his teeth. The blows began to lose some of their force, and the boy seemed to hesitate. So, you won't hit back, eh? Scared to fight, I suppose? David did not answer, and the boy set about him again, but less violently this time, rather as if he felt he had to. Use your fists, you young swine. No! The boy appeared to have grown tired of striking him for at least the moment, and David sat up, blood streaming from his nose. You seem to enjoy a good hiding. Maybe you'd like to thank me for giving you one. The boy's voice was sneering. David regarded him calmly. No, I don't. I don't hate you, and I'd hate you just as much if you'd been anyone else you'd hit. I wouldn't care if you fell dead right now. At least I'd be sure you never look at anything beautiful again.